Welcome to the Application and Modules session. In this session, the topics we'd like to cover are describing what an application in OutSystems is, and we'll focus on the types of applications can have modules. And then we'll also talk about modular programming and some of the benefits that it has and how we use it inside of OutSystems to share and reuse different types of elements. So inside of OutSystems 10, applications can either be web applications or mobile apps, but they can't be both. So you have to choose one or the other because the interaction patterns for each are a little bit different. These applications are allowed to contain one or more modules, and the modules themselves contain elements, and the elements could be something as simple as entities and part of a data model, logic and different types of actions and methods, as well as user interface elements. But applications are the basic deployment unit for the OutSystems server. So when we go to deploy something inside of OutSystems, we deploy applications. We don't deploy modules, and those applications become the key thing that get deployed, and those applications, when they're deployed, will be versioned and tagged, and that will allow us to track them and manage them a little bit easier. So applications are allowed to be deployed, and once they're deployed, they're accessible. But there are times when we build an application and some part of that application is sort of a core component that is reusable. So applications are allowed to access and reuse elements from other applications. And one of the ways we can do this is that we can allow applications to have different modules, and some of those modules can make some of their elements public, thereby sharing them, and that would allow them to be used by other modules. When a module makes something public, the elements that are referenced inside of another app, we say that that creates a dependency from one application to another. And officially, it's creating a dependency from one module to another, but since those modules live inside the applications, and the applications are what are being deployed, then there's a dependency between the actual applications. So let's think about this and look at something a little more concrete, because there are a lot of ideas there. There are different types of application types. So when we go to create a brand new application in OutSystems, we'll choose web or mobile. And once we choose our type, that sort of gives us the interaction pattern that I mentioned earlier. So if we choose a web app, the web app has server-side logic. It has database persistence and entities. It has a synchronous interaction pattern where the pages call the server does a bunch of work and then responds back, and that is the request response pattern. Now, when we think about moving to a mobile application, the mobile application is going to be running mostly in the device, and that means that there's server-side logic and client-side logic, and that client-side logic runs in the device. That client-side logic could be interacting with local data that is stored locally on the device, or it could be calling the server and getting things out of the database. But all of those calls from a screen are happening asynchronously. So if a screen needs multiple types of data, it can make all of those calls at the same time, and whenever the data comes back, we would be rendering it on the screen. And that means that what's happening inside of the device, the client-side logic and the data, needs to be reactive. So if something changes, and it changes locally in the device, it should be able to update, and it shouldn't have to call the server to be able to do that. So when you begin looking at the different types of applications that we can create, web apps are your traditional websites and web pages. They do request response. They can be a little more dynamic because they can have AJAX capabilities inside of them. But our mobile apps are mostly JavaScript and other types of things running on the client device. So we call them reactive, and in reality they're single page applications, and those single page applications are using React JavaScript to go ahead and be able to change things locally as fast as possible. Now, when we choose our application type, if we choose one or the other, there will be the application created, and then it will say what type of module do you want. So if we chose a mobile application, then we would have a choice of a mobile module, but there are actually just 4 types of different modules. So if we chose web, there would be a web choice here, but here we have mobile, and then there can be a blank module or an extension module. But when the application gets created, it automatically creates a module, gives the module a name, whatever that name might be, and then we have to choose the type of module that we wish to create. Applications have to have at least one module. That's why one is here to start with, because if you delete all of the modules from the application has no behavior, no functionality, and it doesn't really make sense to have anything like that. Now when we think of the different module types, the web module will contain all the basic resources for a web application, and that web module could have templates that are going to dictate the look and feel of the website. A mobile module will have all the basic resources for mobile apps, and that will include either the phone, the tablet, or what we call the universal type template. If we have a blank module, the blank module will actually be an empty or a clean module that doesn't have any predefined behaviors, any types of interfaces, so there's basically nothing in the module at all, which is a good thing. And then the extension module would be opened in Integration Studio. And this is a particular type of module that allows us to extend the platform and integrate with other systems. So this is one of those where we may have an extension module that gets us data out of an external database that allows us to use Java or .NET code depending on our server type. So those extension modules are available as well. So we have applications and they have modules inside of them. So why do we have this modular programming capability? Well, in general, it's a software design technique, and what it allows us to do is create independent and then replaceable or reusable modules. And probably the most important piece there is reusable. If Module 3 has some really good functionality and Module 1 wants to use it, it should be able to do that. Same thing here. If Module 2 has some interesting capability, maybe Module 3 and Module 1 want to be able to use it. So each module can contain different types of elements, and if any of those elements would be reusable, we'd like to go ahead and be able to do that. So inside of OutSystems, how would we do that? Well, if we have a core module and that core module has certain types of data and we'd like that data to be reusable in other places, we can come down and actually make it public. And for entities and things like that, once they are public, we can decide whether they should be exposed read-only or whether they should actually be allowed to be updated as well. But when we look inside of a module, data could be made public, different types of logic as far as actions and roles, and then some of the web blocks or web screens could also be shared. So if we were going to share some of these, how would someone else be able to find them? Well, from the menu and the toolbar area, we can find reusable elements by going to Manage Dependencies. And when we go to Manage Dependencies, it will list all of the different modules that we have access to. So depending on our role and who has granted us access to some of these other things, as far as whether we're a developer role or other types of roles, it will give us the list, and these are currently the modules that have some sort of public element that is available. We could go in and say, oh, well, the employees module seems interesting. I'd like to go ahead and be able to get to the employee pictures. So once we choose a module, it will show us what inside of that module is being made public. And in this case, it's just one entity, the picture. We could go ahead and select that, and then we'd be able to use it. Now you can also see here that there are a bunch of little blue circles that kind of look like a recycle thing. And what that's saying is that we had previously looked at these modules and potentially grabbed some of the elements that we wanted to use, and since we did that, these have been updated. So we might need to refresh updated references when something changes in the producer who's producing it and making it available. We're the consumers consuming it. We want to make sure that we have the latest and greatest information so that if they publish their module, we'll be able to have what we need from that. There is this nice new feature in this version of the platform. So in OutSystems 10, we have refresh all that allows us to say, you know what, for any of the modules that I'm using, go ahead and refresh them all and bring all of the things into this particular module. And that speeds things up because a lot of times we'd spend time going through all 4 of these if we needed them and updating each one. So just as an example, field services is an interesting application that is one of our mobile apps that is targeted toward a tablet, and it has a lot of different capabilities. Inside that application itself, it has a module that does all of the logic and work. It has another module for a bunch of assets and data. And then you can see here that it has dependencies. So these are all modules from other applications, and it is showing us all the applications that we're currently dependent on. So, in this case, field services is a very complex application that's using 12 different other things as far as components that it's reusing. Things like Google Maps, the signature pad, some of the Silk capabilities, and the different types of plugins are all things that field services uses. So this concept of creating components that might be reused in multiple places and having a highly reusable component is a really good idea. Now, there are some common patterns for doing this. If we're going to make things reusable, sometimes we take groups of screens or blocks, sort of user interface things that might be related to multiple applications or processes, and we'll go ahead and put all of those screens in one reusable module. We can also do integration. So if we're integrating with an external system like Salesforce or something else, we could go ahead and create that integration, place it inside of one module, and then anyone who needs to be able to use that integration would be able to quickly import and consume that and be able to get the things that it needs. We can also go ahead and encapsulate different types of business concepts. So before we saw the concept of an employee. Well, if we wanted to make an employee a core business entity, then we could go ahead and take all of the data and logic revolving around employees, put it inside of a particular module, and then make that module available. And then a lot of times we have just truly reusable concepts, maybe utilities or small technical features, and we could go ahead and use those. So these are different types of modularization patterns that can be very interesting. So in general, the definition that we had here for modular programming came from Wikipedia. And inside of OutSystems, we do follow these modularization patterns, and we have something called the 4-layer canvas that is part of the architecture of OutSystems applications. So we sort of have a set of best practices that tell you how you can architect your application. And if you want, you could go ahead and read this particular brief on how you can approach that and what it takes to do that. So in this session, we wanted to talk about what an OutSystems application is and the fact that it has modules. Those modules can be of different types, and in many cases we want to be careful about how we create those modules and what we put in them, because we're using modular programming and we want to be able to share and reuse those elements. And as we're doing that, there are different patterns that we can go ahead and follow. And when we follow those patterns, then we'll be able to manage the dependencies and do a good job of making our applications more flexible. And it'll also give developers a little more flexibility to go ahead and reuse things and build things in smaller components and groups. So talked about a lot of things for applications and modules that will set us up to be able to understand building larger applications in the future.